sing along. I couldn't find anybody to introduce me, so I thought I would put up this slide first by way of introduction, and it's also by way of sort of giving you my credentials. First of all, when we talk about the Exodus and the research that I present in my book, The Riddle of the Exodus, and the documentary of the same name, I did this not as an archaeologist, because I am not one. I'm not a Torah scholar. I'm not any scholar by any stretch of the imagination. This is what I do for a living. I shoot video, I make commercials and documentaries, and my two loves, my first love early in life, of course, was motion pictures. I grew up in the cinema. My father was a theater manager. And as I got into Torah, and also because of another film I saw earlier, I was always interested in biblical archaeology. So Hashem has provided the tools and the means that I've been able to combine something with, my first love of Torah, of course. My other loves are filmmaking and biblical archaeology. And what I hope to do today is I hope to dispel or to scrape away out of your minds what I call Discovery Channel archaeology. Okay? And Discovery Channel archaeology, I think some of our other speakers have sort of made allusions to it in a way, really is kind of a shaky path to trod, because you don't really get a lot of the facts, and a lot of what are called facts or are positioned at facts are not really that. In fact, they are often treated as if they are written in stone, if you permit a small pun, and they're not written in stone. I mean, I hope today to not only show you the riddles of the Exodus, solve some of those particular questions, and also to put you into becoming a partner, if you will, with me in continuing to solve this puzzle. And I hope by the end of the talk you'll see that it's not exactly a puzzle at all, and we do have some roreal answers. I have to preface my talk with telling you that I'm very grateful to this gentleman here. He is Paul Rothstein. He is a Holocaust survivor who lives in Tel Shton in Eretz Israel. This is near Kiryat Yearim. And Paul Rothstein is also some people would call him an amateur historian. I think he is right up there with full-fledged, full-time historians. And one of the pleasures of working in the office of Vendel's years ago, I used to work full-time for Vendel, is people sent books to Vendel all the time. And so many so that Vendel could not read them. And so I often wandered into his office and kind of looked at his desk, because some of the stuff was fascinating. And I saw this treatise, if you will, called A Revision of History by Ezra. This was his pen name. This is Paul Rothstein. And in it he put forth the radical idea that possibly we needed to revise our known chronologies, and that we needed to align them with the chronologies given to us by the Chazal, by the sages, by Torah sages, who have had knowledge of their own history for centuries. And, I think Jack alluded to the idea that we shouldn't present anything new. If it's new, it's not from Torah. This is not new information. Most of what I'm presenting today has been around for centuries. And Paul Rothstein is the one that introduced me to this idea. I spent 4 hours videotaping an interview with him, which I ended up using only a few minutes in the documentary, because he only speaks French and Ivrit, Hebrew, and I speak neither. I can basically make my way through a menu in Jerusalem, and possibly only that. So he was very kind to share his ideas with me, and Baruch Hashem, his treatise was in English, and this set me on the path to try to, his thesis made so much sense to me that I had to continue to prove it. And what has been amazing is through the years, I've continued to find support for his thesis that we have been looking in the wrong time period for the event that we all know as the Exodus. And that's why we've been unable to prove the Exodus. We've simply been looking in the wrong time period. Now, archaeology originally was called a science or a discipline that investigates through the study of traditions, oral traditions, monuments, and written manuscripts. This is no longer accepted as the traditional role of archaeology. They now the discipline itself, and this is found in a first-year book for first-year archaeological students by Donald Fagan. The study of archaeology is the study of material remains, human cultures, using archaeological theory and techniques. That is our key word here, friends, theory. If I disabuse you of any notions tonight before you leave here, I want you to know that archaeology is not a science. It is a discipline that employs scientific tools. But you'll find this out. There's an old joke. It was told to me by a rabbi years ago. You've heard this joke. If you have four rabbis in a room, you have 5 opinions. All right? If you have 4 archaeologists around a artifact that has just been exhumed from the earth, you get 5 opinions. They want you to base every opinion and everything that you draw from this, every conclusion is based literally in situ. What you find there in the site, you cannot allow written documents. However, in this same book called In the Beginning by Donald Fagan, as I said, it's by for first-year archaeologists. They do allow written text, especially if they're ancient written text, because then they also become an archaeological record or even an artifact itself. Hence, we can allow into our research the Dead Sea Scrolls. But there's a problem, because opinion still stumbles into the argument and still muddies the water. And what I want to read to you is the Dead Sea Scrolls should be prime proof of one of the most valuable archaeological finds ever in the state of modern Israel. Not only are they ancient, at least 2,000 years of age, they also are written artifacts. Yet, when they had this conference on the Dead Sea Scrolls, over 50 years after they've been found, a debate erupted over the Dead Sea Scrolls, because and in fact, this is what the text of this news story said. Some of the participants in the conference did not want to be on the same stage with those who didn't share the same opinion they did of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So after 50 years of having these artifacts and scrolls and documents in our hands, people still cannot agree on the Dead Sea Scrolls. But we'll continue on. And we also have some problems that we run into with this discipline. A gentleman on television said this the other day. I was watching a documentary about the Exodus, and I wanted to have one of those rubber bricks you throw at the screen. He said in a very smug way, there is nothing archaeologically to attest to anything from the biblical story of the Exodus. No plagues, no parting of the Red Sea. But there's a problem with that. Maybe not archaeologically, and I hope today that we'll show you that there is archaeological, at least if not evidence, at least connections. He wouldn't have said this if he had asked the Jewish people. Okay? Which brings me again to the question that I'm often asked when I give these lectures is why would you, and I've given it mostly to observant audiences, Orthodox audiences, why do you need to give this lecture to the Jewish people if they believe this already? Basically, it's for several reasons. It is to, I think, to enrich their faith, to also, they're told by the sages, to answer the apikoris, the scoffers. And it's also very pivotal for us as Noahides and for the Jewish people to realize this really happened and to believe it happened in a very real way, because there is a very pivotal concept that ties the story of the Exodus even to ownership of the land of Israel. And I'll show you that when we get through with this. Now, the problems that we also suffer with archaeology is there is a double standard. Ancient and Near Eastern documents and monuments will relate battles. that have been won by their gods. For instance, here are 3 inscriptions. I'll call 2 of them on stone. One of them is found in a written document. It says on this inscription from Tiglath-Pileser, with the help of the god Ashur, I took chariots and warriors, I burnt their cities and razed them. He says with the help of his god. Also, Thutmose III, and by the way, that's what the Greeks called him. His real name was Dahutamosh, his real Egyptian name. He gives credit to his god. Okay? Now, this gentleman, Joshua, gives credit to his god. The 7th time the priest blew the shofarot, and Joshua said to the people, shout, for God has given you the city. Do you see a double standard here? In essence, we have 3 documents, 3 attestations to battles won for these people by their God, but this one is disqualified because, they brought God into the mix. Well, what did these 2 gentlemen do? So it's not a level playing field. They also discount the Jewish sources. All right? Go to our next slide. Now Moses, often the proof is given that Moses, we have no archaeological proof of Moses. We have no inscriptions to Moses. We have no statues to Moses. For this audience, I don't even have to tell you why that we won't have that, because of course the Jews would, God forbid, raise a monument to Moses. So therefore you've diminished the possibility of having statues or inscriptions graven in stone to the exploits of this great person, Moshe Rabbeinu. So that completely diminishes the event of us finding archaeological proof of the life of Moses. So that's another problem right there. By the way, I want to mention, how many of you ever heard of Professor Anson Rainey? He is a specialist in cuneiform. He has undertaken the job of translating most of the tablets found at Tel Armana in Egypt. He's a specialist in this, and even though he says that he doesn't believe in some of the things written in the Bible, he says the Bible, the Tanakh, is remarkable as a document of geographical significance and also of its battles. He says that these 2 things make it a document that, even though he doesn't believe that in the holy aspects of the Bible, of the Tanakh, he believes that there is much to support the claims made about the book because of its geography and because even of the battles and the way they're described. Military tacticians will tell you that the battles as they're described in the Tanakh are great models for modern battles today. Now, here is what I want to do is I'm going to attempt very quickly in this hour to scrape away what you have learned about the Exodus, because most of it's probably wrong unless you've heard my speech lectures before. And I want to replace it with what we call more potent information, something that you can use and you can remember this when you talk to people who say this hasn't happened or you see these TV shows. This is the problem that we encounter, and all of you who work with computers know this. It's an old rule, garbage in, garbage out. You cannot get the correct data from a computer unless you input the correct data. Okay? This is what happens in the study of attempting to find out whether the Exodus really happened. And what happens, first of all, this is major. The actual length of the Israelite exile, that is, when Jacob and his family, the 70 souls, came down into Egypt and they began their exile, and then they departed the day of the Exodus so many years later. Now, I'm going to tell you something that may shock you. I would call into question, and I would make you question any scholar who tells you that this event happened, that the exile was 400 years. Because your Torah does not even support that. All right? The other problem we also run into is the dating methodology. The dynastic chart is also suspect. We have problems with cultural evidence or physical evidence, and also the pharaohs. We often choose the wrong pharaohs. Now, as far as the 400-year exile that Israel was supposed to have experienced in the land of Egypt, We're told in Bereshit, in Genesis, Hashem says to Avram, know for surety that your descendants will be foreigners in a land that is not theirs for 400 years. They will be enslaved and they will be impressed. That's oppressed rather, not impressed, well, possibly. But they will basically have 3 periods of this prophecy coming to pass. And over here it says, but I will finally bring judgments against the nation who enslaves them, and they will leave with great wealth. Now, right there, Bereshit, it tells us it'll be 400 years. However, when we go to Shemot, the book of Exodus, we read, now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years, and it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day, it came to pass that all the host of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. Well, which was it? Was it 400 or was it 430? Does the Torah contradict itself? No. This is why we all need to study, we all need to learn, if we can, God willing, we need to learn Hebrew when we study Torah. If you can, you will get a wealth of information from the original Hebrew, and you'll also be dispelled of some misconceptions about these periods. Basically, these prophecies are right, but not in the way that you think, okay? Now, we know, what I'm going to show you here very quickly is the fact that the text of the Torah does not support the idea that the children of Israel were there literally 400 years, if you just simply read the text. If you go to Genesis 46:8, you'll find out that Levi and Kohath, these are of course the generations going up to Moshe Rabbeinu. Levi and Kohath were alive when the 70 entered Egypt, all right? Now, if you go to a source called Seder HaOlam, you will be told exactly how old Levi was and how old his son Kohath was when they entered the land of Egypt. But we won't go to that source just now. Let's stay with what the text of the Torah, what the written page of the Torah, and this is what scholars rely on when they tell you about the 400 years. They don't read this. For instance, what the text of the Torah does tell us is that Levi lived 137 years, Kohath lived 133, Amram, the father of Moshe Rabbeinu, lived 137, and that Moshe was 80 years old when the Exodus began. But let's do this. Let's start with Kohath, who was alive when, this is the son of Levi, when they entered Egypt. If you simply, let's just say, for sake of argument, he was 1 year old. He was actually older. Let's just say, for sake of argument, at that period of time when they entered Egypt, that he was exactly 1 year old. And that when he got into the last year, again, this is just a theory, and I don't want you to accept it, by the way, but this is for the sake of argument, that on the last year of his life, he gave birth to Amram. And let's posit that on the last year of Amram's life, he gave birth to Moses. And that, of course, Moses at 80 began with the story of the Exodus. If you stack their ages up, you come to the figure of 350 years. So we're actually short the 400 years. But we can explain that very easily. The promise is given to Abraham 430 years before the Israelites leave Egypt. All right? That's why Shemot can say it was 430 years to the day. To what day? To the day that the promise was given at the covenant of the pieces to Avraham Avinu. It was 430 years to the day. The prophecy kicked into place. The prophecy began. The prophetic clock began ticking with the birth of Isaac, of Isaac. 30 years later, Isaac was born, and from the birth of Isaac until the exodus of Egypt was exactly 400 years. And you can prove this even with your Torah by taking the ages, all right, the ages of Jacob and Isaac. When Isaac was 60, when Jacob was born, Jacob was 130. When they entered Egypt, you add that up, you subtract it, you get 210 years. When I give this lecture to an observant Jewish audience, and I ask the audience how long the Israelites were in Egypt, usually it's the little 9-year-old yeshiva kid up front who says, 210 years. He knows that right away. Why? Because the oral Torah, which is just as relevant, or if not more relevant than the written Torah, and the Midrash all tell it was 210 years. In fact, there's a very interesting thing when we read in Shemot where Jacob is told by Hashem in a dream to go down to Egypt. That the phrase there, which contains the word redu, to go down, the phrase, the gematria of that phrase is 210, interestingly enough. Now, the other thing that we have to get rid of is the idea that the chronology that is given to us about the Empire of Egypt is accurate and written in stone. It is not. What we know about it comes mostly from the Greeks, and it was written in Greeks for the Greek. We know this because, and we've been able to find out the length of the reigns of the pharaohs because of documents written in hieroglyphic, also in Demotic, and also in Greek. And by the way, the word hieroglyphic is an adverb. Don't ever use it to describe writing on the wall. Don't call them hieroglyphs. Or don't call them hieroglyphics. They're simply hieroglyphs. All right. The Rosetta Stone found that El Rashid in Egypt has all three of these scripts. The translation for this hieroglyphs did not finally happen until the 1860s, thanks to the Frenchman Francois Champollion. He was able to, with the help of others, to break the code of hieroglyphs, and we were able to read all of these monuments found all over Egypt. And we were able to discover, first of all, if you want to read hieroglyphs, I'll help you very quickly. It's a very easy thing to do. You simply look at the characters, and if the animal figures and characters are facing that direction, you begin reading hieroglyphs from the left and read them left to the right. If the characters are facing the right, you start from the right and read to the left. And if you're reading them down, you always read them from the top to the bottom, never from the bottom up. All right? Something you should know about hieroglyphs, going back to the first kingdom, the first period of Egyptian history. Hieroglyphs, like ancient Hebrew, never had any vowels. So when you see the name of a site in hieroglyphs or the name of a pharaoh, the vowels are educated guesses. That's all they are. We simply fill them in. We don't know what the consonants carry the vowel sound. There's some other characteristics about hieroglyphs we'll talk about in just a moment. I.E.S. Edwards, a Egyptologist, told us that our knowledge of Egyptian chronologies, this is the chart of 30 dynasties that goes through the years, that counts the families of the pharaohs, tells us that they're very incomplete, they're very uncertain. We know the main sequence of events, the general flow of time, frequently their relationship to one another, but except in rare cases, the exact chronology will not be possible until the discovery of material that is more precisely datable. How many of you ever heard this on a documentary on television where they tell you, well, the Egyptian chronology is not really that solid? It's not. Since the inception of the dynastic chart, this is a rough view of it right here, the 30-odd dynasties, from the pre-dynastic to the Old Kingdom all the way up to the time of Ptolemy taking over. From the time that this was set in place as a scholarly tool, by the way, the ancient Egyptians didn't know about dynasties. They didn't call them that. They didn't regard the dynasty before them or generally after them in case it could support their kingship. This has been changed. This chart has been changed over 20 times since it was put in place. It's been shortened by 3,000 years. I wouldn't call that written in stone. It's still changing, by the way. But this is why it's a major problem. And we learned this from 5 professors in England. 2 of them wrote a book called Centuries of Darkness. And they tell us that the dates conventionally attributed to the ancient history of Egypt are inflated by as much as 2.5 centuries. A very controversial book, but they make a very good case because they show us that this very shaky chart that we call the Egyptian chronology impacts all of these ancient cultures. Because when archaeologists are digging in these cultures, they use the Egyptian dynastic chart as their template. Even the Israelite history is based on the Egyptian chronology. Now here's the other problem we run into with archaeology, and that's cultural evidence. All right? Anybody know how old these spear tips are? Anybody want to guess? Just quick guess. Anybody?
200 years.
Very good. But what if I found them in the Middle East? See, because there is a again, we're talking about in situ. But here's the problem. And this is what they call the three-system method of dating. You've heard of Paleolithic, Neolithic, that type of thing. The idea is that when you dig into an archaeological site, the tools, whether they're stone, whether they're iron, whether they're copper, tells you exactly the age of that culture. That is so wrong. It's so wrong because do we have people today still using tools that are stone? We do. Now, this is what I call the alien archeologist. All right? They're very much like our own archaeologists because they have to use the same kind of thinking. And there's nothing wrong with it, by the way. The alien archaeologist cannot, he decides because he's alien, he doesn't want to scare these gentlemen. So he doesn't talk to them, he doesn't interact with them, he simply observes their tools, their way of life, in the limited time he's allowed to spend on our planet. So he goes back to his planet and he tells the people of his planet that this is what the people of Earth are like in the year 2008. I know it's 2008 because these guys are using a GPS tracking device to hunt with. So you see, it's problematic. All these dating. I'm not saying throw them out. I'm saying we need to be more careful with them. We need to be more circumspect, if you will. Now we have the problem with the pharaohs. All right, everybody tries to use a certain pharaoh to prove their own thesis of when the Exodus occurred. All right, and they either think that the Hyksos are actually the Hebrews. And they say, well, it happened sometime during the Hyksos period, which is the 13th through the 17th dynasties, or it happened during the 18th dynasty because either for the reason that Amos sounds like Moses, or they use Akhenaten because he was a monotheist. So therefore, you bet. I talked to an Englishman who is a great scholar on ancient metallurgy, and he says he's convinced that the Israelites learned about monotheism from Akhenaten. So, and then of course, here's the most famous one, Ramesses the Great. All right? Well, again, we have problems with these people. First of all, we're talking about the Pharaoh of the Exodus. This is Amasis. All right? The first problem we have is that what happened to the Pharaoh of the Exodus? He either left Egypt and didn't come back, or he was drowned in the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds. But we have his mummy. It's intact. All right? He also was a pharaoh who fought the Hyksos. In fact, on a wall in Egypt, we have an inscription by a gentleman who fought for Amos against the Hyksos. Now, the reason I want to tell you that the Hyksos do not work as the Israelites. And by the way, all of those people who say that the Hyksos have to be the Israelites, they ignore Torah, first of all. Because the Hyksos were recognized even by Egyptian historians of antiquity, the classic historians, such as Manetho. They were recognized as kings of Egypt, as pharaohs. Now we know Joseph sat on the chair of the prime minister and really ran the country. But was he crowned pharaoh? No. Was there ever any of the Israelites who were crowned the Pharaoh of Egypt? No, not as far as I know. Not according to what I found in the Torah or the Midrash. So the Hyksos are not allowed because they were recognized. They're even on the monumental evidence left. They were considered pharaohs. The Egyptians were not happy with them because we're told by one of the Egyptian queens, Hatshepsut, on her temple, that they came in like a storm. They overran the country, they burned down the temples of the Egyptians, they desecrated their gods, and they cut off the hands of all of their captives. Does that sound like 70 people coming in peacefully to settle in the land of Goshen? No. So I think there are many other, and I think you'll see there are other reasons that it doesn't work either. The Aramana tablets are connected to Pharaoh Akhenaten. Pharaoh Akhenaten had a lot of correspondence with other crowns around the Middle East, the Near East, and they communicated in cuneiform. It was the lingua franca of the day. In fact, some of the letters actually mention a place called Jerusalem, and also mention a people called the Habiru. And Habiru in the ancient tongue meant someone who was a sojourner or someone who crossed over. And of course, Hebrew comes from the word Ever, which is where we get the word over, because the ancestor of the Jews crossed over. And Akhenaten, of course, it was a monotheist allegedly, and he also doesn't work, as you'll see in a moment, because basically he was living in the wrong time period. This is another pharaoh, and I have to tell you, I'm not able to look at my notes, and I lost the note. I forgot which pharaoh this one is, but he's dead. This is Ramesses the Great. I'm glad that you've had time to digest your lunch. Ramesses the Great does not work at all for me as the pharaoh of the Exodus. We'll look at his mummy as long as we can, and I'll tell you why we're showing you his mummy. In the 1970s, they discovered that the pharaoh known as Ramesses the Great, Ramesses II, they brought in, his mummy was decomposing too rapidly, and they wanted to save it. So they did some forensics work on the mummy, and they found out that he had died from a dental infection. Apparently, pharaohs didn't have a dental plan. So apparently he was, oh, by the way, he died at a very, very advanced age. So I'm going to step out on a limb here and say that he was not drowned in the Sea of Reeds. And if he did, they recovered his body. But if he did, he was dead before he hit the sea because his teeth killed him, according to forensic experts. All right. Now, anybody remember this movie? All right. I always test the age of my audience by asking them if they know who Cecil B. DeMille's first choice was to play Moses. Anybody know the answer? It wasn't Charlton Heston. He was the second choice.
Sterling Hayden?
No. That's an interesting answer. No. A guy you and I know is Hopalong Cassidy. He was the first choice. The actor, and I've suddenly lost his name. He was the actor who DeMille was really devoted to him. They were old friends, and he thought he was, because Hoppy was such, he'd become such a upstanding figure to the American child, and in his movies, that he thought he would be the right age, and everybody would know that, you know, this is typecasting. This is a man we all look up to. But Hoppy didn't want to do the part. He said, probably said something like, well, if you let me wear my hat, and that wasn't going to work. But anyway, there's a lot of problems with the movie, and one of the problems is the major impact the movie had on all of us, and even on scholarship. Because how many times does the name of the Pharaoh of the Exodus appear in the Torah? None. He's not mentioned. How many times does the word Ramesses appear? In the Tanakh, it's there 5 times. 4 of those times, it's in the Torah. Ramesses is always a geographical designation, never the name of a pharaoh. Now, this is a very important point. It's a very vital point because we notice in the Tanakh that pharaohs are named after the Exodus. Pharaoh Necho, Pharaoh Shishak, Pharaoh Chopra. There are a whole number of pharaohs, so we can know that time period was after the Exodus. And I think the reason, this is merely a theory, and the reason the pharaohs are not named in the Torah, remember Abraham's pharaoh is not mentioned, the pharaoh of Joseph's time is not mentioned, none of the pharaohs of the Exodus experience are mentioned, their names are not mentioned, because they were worshipped as gods, apparently, and Hashem would not allow their names to be written in the Torah. That's just a guess on my part. That also could possibly show us the time period. But the problem here is that in this trailer that was shown all over the world with Cecil B. DeMille, in his study with all the props in the movie, talking about the movie that was upcoming, and I saw this movie as a 10-year-old child, and I was knocked out by it, probably why I'm doing the lecture today. In this movie, he opens up a massive Bible, and he puts his pencil down on it, and he reads, "And the Pharaoh Ramesses made the lives of the Israelites a great bondage and much suffering." Well, I went to my Bible, I went to my Torah, and I couldn't find that line. But millions of people saw him say that. Now, he had 5 scholars, he had 5 biblical scholars as consultants on this film. This is the story of the most pivotal event in the history of the Jewish people. One of those scholars was a rabbi. The other 4 were either historical or Christian scholars. The rabbi was quick, dear, what's the name of the restaurant there in Springdale? Mama Z's? Zoppi, Rabbi Zoppi. I say that because we have an Italian restaurant and they have the same last name there in Arkansas. It's Rabbi Zoppi. He was the only scholar of a rabbinical stripe that worked on this movie. And they even decided to throw out much of the Midrash. They knew the story of how Moses got his speech impediment and decided they could not use it because they couldn't have Heston going around speaking with what we would today call a hair lip. So they threw out that story in the Midrash of his speech impediment. The problem is that this was such a strong thing that even the scholar that worked on the film published a giant tome, Henry Nordlinger. It was called no, that's another book. But anyway, the point is he published this book based on his research, and scholarly shelves were full of this book talking about Ramesses being the pharaoh of the Exodus. Ramesses doesn't work for me because, first of all, we found his mummy. It's there today. You can see it in Cairo. He died, according to forensic specialists, of a dental infection at a very advanced age. And also, the other problem is that the scholars will tell you that the reason that we know it was the pharaoh Ramesses is because the region given to the Israelites was named after him. Well, I say, no, that's not right, because if that's the case, then his grandfather, who was the first pharaoh known as Ramesses, would have been alive when Joseph was alive. And here's the problem. We have Ramesses I reigning 2 years. Now, this would have supposedly been the pharaoh who ruled, the first Ramesside pharaoh who ruled, all right, when the Israelites came into Egypt, and supposedly Joseph was his prime minister. Ramesses only ruled 2 years. His son said he only ruled 11 years. Ramesses II ruled 67 years. If you add all this up, you get 79 years. If the Exodus occurred at the end of his life, when he died at 67, we have a total of 79 years. How long did Joseph serve as prime minister? 80 years. That means if this story is consistent with the biblical story, that Joseph lived 1 year longer than the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And that doesn't work for me because Joseph died and the new Pharaoh knew not Joseph. So he doesn't work for me. These are some other computations which I'm not going to bother you with, but if you take what is known as the generally accepted dates, which is 480 years after the Exodus, Solomon built the temple, the Beit HaMikdash. If you add up the death of Ramesses according to the generally accepted date, along with the generally accepted date of Solomon's temple being built, you still come up with, you overshoot by about 200 years. It doesn't work. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to scrape all of it away and show you startling parallels between the Egyptian archaeological record and Jewish text. Because what we have to do is, if we want to find the Exodus story in history, in the Egyptian annals, we have to find a time that was greatly and dramatically affected by the Exodus. Because we're talking about a very dramatic time period. It had to be a time period where there was great disaster, there was great chaos, and we also have to find at least some characters in the Egyptian record who are consistent with the story of the Exodus. So let's see if we can find them. But let me digress very quickly, okay, to show you that we do have other great evidence of and by the way, the minimalists, the people who say that you can't believe what you find in the Bible, that there's no archaeological records of biblical events. Let me quickly give you a real quick tour through some events that are not Exodus events that do reference directly. Of course, we have the Merneftah stele right here, and this is in the Cairo Museum, and this document right here, this is a determinative right here, these three hash marks with a man and a woman. This tells you, this isn't speaking of Israel. This is the inscription that literally mentions Israel as a people. Now, they say that Merneftah, who lived after Ramesses the Great, could have been the Pharaoh of the Exodus, or his father could have been the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But also the problem with that is that the Egyptians, on one of their monumental records, mention Israel as a discrete people. Were the Hebrews known as Israel when they lived in Egypt? No, they were not. They were known as Hebrews, and the Egyptians used it as a pejorative term, like gypsies or wanderers. By the way, if you go to the museum in Cairo, this is about 12 feet high. And most of the Egyptian tour guides will not take you over it. You have to ask them to show you this, because it says Israel on it. This is an ancient inscription found in Jordan, and it was found at a site called Der Elah. And the inscription in Aramaic, which they date roughly to the 8th or 9th century before the Common Era, mentions directly the seer Balaam and the prophecies that he makes. So we have a biblical character here who the ancient walls written in lime, by the way, it was lime plaster written with ink, just as you read in the Torah how the Israelites were instructed when they entered the land, they were to plaster rocks with lime and write the Torah on it. We have another, of course, Jericho. Jericho is an amazing site. Kathleen Kenyon, the British archaeologist and anthropologist, said that Jericho did not work for her as the biblical Jericho because the pottery was missing from the time period of the Exodus. She actually based her evidence on what she didn't find. But they did find some remarkable things there. If you go quickly to the Torah, we just got through reading this, I think, in the Haftorah this past week or two. We're told in the book of Joshua, they went to Rahab's house. It was part of the city wall. Israel celebrated its Passover right before the siege of Jericho. They were told to leave everything except silver and gold. The walls will fall with a shout of the shofarot blast, and Jericho would be put to the torch. Now, this is what we found archaeologically at Jericho. Housing was built onto the outer walls, just like Rahab's house. The dwellings were found to be, we found this when we began to excavate Jericho. They found in the ruins of Jericho, they found pot after pot. This is the 1930s and 40s and 50s. They found them brimming with grain. They saw that the city had been attacked and had been destroyed. And they were scratching their heads and going, no army in antiquity ever attacked an ancient city and left their food stores intact. But according to the book of Joshua, they were commanded not to touch anything except the gold and the silver. And of course we have walls and floors were blackened or reddened by fire. Every room was filled with fallen bricks and timbers. Debris was heavily burnt, but the collapse of the eastern rooms facing the camp of Israel, if you will, seemed to have taken place before they were affected by fire. Something brought the walls of Jericho down, and then something or someone burnt the walls and the city. Completely consistent with what we have just read in the book of Joshua. But archaeologists still argue today this is not the biblical Jericho, the ruins that are there. The Tel Dan fragment is a wonderful artifact that speaks directly of David HaMelech, King David, and the house of David. We have the Mesha stele, which mentions an occurrence in 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 4 and 5. Mesha actually rebels against Israel. And there's another wonderful inscription on here that most people ignore. It's at the bottom of the inscription. It says, and the men of Gad lived in Atarot from ancient times, and the king of Israel built Atarot for himself. The men of Gad, what happened when the Israelites were going to cross over into Eretz Israel? Didn't two of the tribes ask to have land on the other side of the Jordan, in what is today present Jordan, which is near Atarot? By the way, they don't like this artifact. We have, this of course is the wall that tells us about the battle of the taking of several Israel towns by the Pharaoh Shishak. We find a designation for Yud-Melech, which could be the kingdom of Judah. Now, here's where we get down to the nitty-gritty. Now, this is nothing against the Chinese or the Japanese, but do you see my point? If you want to know about the most pivotal event in the history of the people of Israel, of the Jewish people today, something that has affected their lives through centuries, something that they recognize every year during Pesach, who do you ask? You ask the Jewish people. You look to their Torah, you look to their Tanakh, you look to their sages, Chazal, you look to the Midrash, you look at the oral tradition, which is a deep and lengthy tradition, and it's a deep source that will tell you many things about the Exodus that you don't find on the pages of the Torah. Okay? And it will lead us into answering this question. One of the reasons we're able to track down when the Exodus really happened is because, of course, time is sacred to the Jewish people. We know that because they continue today and from antiquity to commemorate all of their Hagim, all of their festivals. And, of course, the most important place in time, Shabbat, is recognized. So the Israelites, the Jewish people, and even before they were Israel, time was sacred to them. Abraham is said to have given the secret of the leap year to the Egyptians. Abraham understood the calendar. The Jews have always understood the calendar, and they've kept their own. It's called Seder HaOlam. Seder HaOlam is the only ancient chronology that I have found of the Near East that has no gaps in it. It starts with the birth of Adam and comes up to the present day period. It grows, it's organic because everything is happening in time. And you can find the exact date, and if not the date, you can find the exact year of every important event in the world of antiquity, or at least of the people of Israel. And by the way, if you want to find a copy, it was written down hundreds of years ago, but the most modern rendering of it is in a wonderful book called the Codex Judaica, and you can get it from Amazon. Codex Judaica takes the Seder HaOlam, the Order of the Ages it's called, and gives you a year by year. You can find out the flood happened 1656 from Adam, etc. All of the important dates. When the Tower of Babel was destroyed, 1996 from Adam. We can look to that also to find out when the Exodus occurred. Now, again, we are familiar with this one. It says that 400 years is the time period that they would, of course, enjoy this sort of, not enjoy, but experience a kind of Exodus experience. And what we're looking at, first of all, is the fact that this time, all these time periods are accurate. But if we want to find out more about that period, we can look into a well-known midrash called the Sefer HaYashar. And just as a quick show of hands, how many of you have heard of Sefer HaYashar? Okay. And how many of you know it as the book of Jasher? Probably everybody. Now, I came under some fire a few years ago because I used this as a source, as one of the sources to prove my thesis, or at least to present evidence of it. The reason is because in the 1800s, the Mormons began to print the English version of this. But the English version of the Sefer HaYashar was translated by a Jew. In fact, he is a gentleman by the name, if you have any of the English translations, you'll see the preface written by M. Noah, Mordecai Noah. He was the first Zionist in our country. He was the consul to Tunisia. He was a contemporary of Presidents John Adams and Jefferson. He was considered a very great Jew, and he tried in his time to get people to return and repopulate the land of Israel. He translated the Sefer HaYashar. And by the way, one of the professors of Hebrew in New York that attested to the veracity and the eloquence of this translation into English was Professor George Bush, a direct ancestor of our president today. Same family. I wish he would act like his ancestor. But now there is a rabbinical discussion over whether this verse in the Tanakh, in Joshua 10:13, 2 Samuel, is referring to this book. There is a little bit of dispute. Some say no, the Sefer HaYashar is the Torah. But again, it's a little bit of a debate. I'm willing to give them that, except that the Sefer HaYashar that I have, and I have, by the way, I have this version in Ivrit that's published in Israel, and I have two friends in the rabbinical community who have this version. One of them gave it to me as a gift. I gave them the English translation that was translated in 1840, and they tell me that over and over the English translation is consistent with the Hebrew text. And there's somebody else that believed that the Sefer HaYashar that we have today in English was also a text with some value, the late Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. How many of you have read or have Me'am Loez, also known as the Torah Anthology? It's a, what is it, 18 volumes, 15 volumes? It's massive. I have it at home. It was a gift from my lovely wife. If you've read Me'am Loez, Kaplan consistently over and over attributes events that he speaks of to the Sefer HaYashar. And when I read those in his commentary, they are exactly consistent with what I read with the English translation of Sefer HaYashar. It tells us that the Pharaoh of the oppression, the Pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites, sat on the throne of Egypt for exactly 94 years. He was 20 when he began to reign. He didn't live, he sat on the throne 94 years. All right? It tells us the Pharaoh of the Exodus, his son, only ruled 4 years, and he was called Adikam Ahuz. And if you'll forgive me, a very loose translation is short, fat, ugly guy. Now I'm not gonna say that this is him, except that this statue was carved in the same time period that we believe that the Exodus occurred. It is a nobleman, and he's called Huram Hotep, so he was a nobleman, and he fits the description we find of Adikam in the Sefer HaYashar. And he ruled only 4 years. It says that Melol, his father, reigned 94 years, and he was sick, he died, and it was because he was evil before the Lord. Now, we have this, the Pharaoh of the oppression, sat on the throne, he enslaved the Israelites. The enslavement began very subtly, by the way. In the Hebrew, when you translate it, it says the Egyptians spoke with a soft mouth. They tricked the Israelites into bondage. And it says that later this Pharaoh came to the throne. He knew not Joseph. Josephus, the historian, says it was actually from a different family. And by the way, this can also be found of our Egyptian Pharaoh in the Egyptian record, as I'll show you in just a moment. The Pharaoh of the Exodus, this is the one that Moses came back to and said, let my people go. He ruled 4 years. He was called Adikam. All right? Can we find these people in this chronology of Egypt? Yes, we can. Or at least we can find people that parallel these two figures. In the Old Kingdom period, during the 6th dynasty, there are two pharaohs that fit the description we just gave you exactly. There is a pharaoh in the 6th dynasty who is famous in the entire history of Egypt for one thing. He lived and he served as pharaoh longer than any pharaoh in Egyptian history. He served as pharaoh for exactly 94 years. His son ruled, according to two different sources, ruled 1 year or 4 years, which of course parallels to what the Jewish record says about the Pharaoh of the Exodus. All right? These are their names. I'll give them to you very quickly here. Not so quickly. There we go. The Pharaoh who ruled 94 years, according to, and by the way, scholars don't dispute this, by the way. This is one of those wonderful things where the scholars of Egyptian history and archaeologists in agreement. The Pharaoh who ruled 94 years is known either as Neferkara, or he's also called Pepi II. Pepi was the family name. He had a son called Neferkara, and then we have a curious person down here. This is a woman. Now, this is two parallels to the Jewish story, the Jewish sources of the Exodus. Two parallels very quickly. We have two pharaohs, Pepi II, who ruled 94 years. We have his son called Neferkari, sometimes Neferkari the Younger, who ruled 4 years. Now, the Pharaoh of the Exodus either died at the Sea of Reeds, or according to another opinion, he survived and actually went on to rule another country. Either way, he did not return to rule Egypt. On the Egyptian annals and the Egyptian archaeological record, this pharaoh is the first woman pharaoh of Egypt. Now, Barbara Mertz, an Egyptologist, will tell you, that's not her, Barbara Mertz will tell you that, and this is a woman that said this, a woman archaeologist said that for a woman to be sitting on the throne at the end of the Old Kingdom period showed you that something was terribly wrong with the empire, because it was a patrilineal throne. This period at the end of the reign of Neferkari the Younger, the pharaoh who ruled 4 years, was a period for some reason followed by great chaos. That is our other parallel. And this again is something that all Egyptologists and all archaeologists all agree on. There's no argument. When I interviewed Professor Zahi Hawass, who is the high mucky-muck of Egyptian antiquities in Egypt, I have him on tape in the documentary, saying that the Old Kingdom period came to an end very rapidly, and we don't know why. We have theories, but this is our other bullet point, if you would, that we're looking for. Is there a time period in Egyptian history that matches the events of the Exodus? Think about it. The Exodus was a year of devastating plagues, and don't fool yourself. These were horrible plagues on the people of Egypt, followed by the most devastating plague of all, the most devastating strike, the matot, the strikes, the death of the firstborn. The sages tell us that the Egyptians were so promiscuous as a people that there were many, many firstborn deaths. Then we follow that with the drowning of the entire armed forces, or most of them, the entire chariot corps and most of the army of the Egyptian people in the Sea of Reeds. And right before that, when the Israelites left, they borrowed much of the gold and silver from the Egyptians. So you have devastating plagues that last over a year-long period. You have the death of the firstborn. You have losing your army in the Sea of Reeds. By the way, archaeologists, some of them will tell you that the records show that at the end of the Old Kingdom period, at the end of the 6th dynasty, when these people reigned, that there was no standing army for some reason. At the end of the reign of these two pharaohs, they call this the end of the Old Kingdom period. It's the end of the 6th dynasty, and the reason that they draw a demarcation line and say we begin a new era is because the next era was a period of great chaos and darkness. It was a dark age that gripped ancient Egypt for almost 400 years. So we have 3 parallels. We have 2 pharaohs whose reigns are consistent with the sources from the Jewish, from Chazal and from Midrash. We have the first woman pharaoh of Egypt, not to be confused with Hatshepsut. She came later. We also have this period of great... At no other time in the history of Egypt is there any period to mark this. The time of Ramesses was a relatively stable time. The minimalists call the Exodus, it's probably a slave revolt. Well, there probably was a slave revolt, but it didn't bring the country to its knees. This is a statue of Pepi I. And Pepi I was a new family. According to the Egyptian sources, they were a foreign family. And when they took the throne, there was a lot of intrigue. There were assassinations. There were 2 pharaohs between him and Pharaoh Pepi II. One of the other artifacts that we find is at Abydos. We have a king's list at the rear of the temple. I've been here. And this king's list mentions the pharaoh we call Pepi II. And we also get the length of his reign. This is his cartouche. Anybody know where the word cartouche comes from? It comes from the French. When Napoleon conquered Egypt and the French soldiers began to uncover all these artifacts like the Rosetta Stone, they looked at that and went, look, it looks like one of our cartouches, the cartridges, the sausage-shaped cartridges, powder charges they put in their muskets. Okay? By the way, another thing I want to disabuse you of is, for instance, pyramid is not an Egyptian word. Pyramid is a Greek word. Obelisk is a Greek word. Okay? The ancient Egyptians called their country Kam or Kant. Kam sounds very much like their ancestor Ham. The Turin Papyrus also gives us the same list of pharaohs and the length of their reigns. So we have 2 archaeological records that these 2 pharaohs existed, 94 years and 4 years. Is any of this confusing to people right now? Okay, I hope not. I can be confusing sometimes. All right? This is another monument. This is actually an archaeological artifact found in the Brooklyn Museum. The Brooklyn Museum is a very fine museum, by the way. This is Pepi II and his mother, who many of the sources in Egyptology tell us that she actually reigned until this young man was ready to take the throne. He was officially pharaoh. Yes, ma'am.
Was the firstborn that died because of a plague Where did he fit into?
He was not firstborn. His older brother was the firstborn, and the Midrash tells us that he could not serve because he had mental problems. So,
but one of them was killed in the plague, right? The Pharaoh's son was killed in the plague?
well, one or two of them, he had many sons, but the Pharaoh who reigned did not die because he was not firstborn. According to Sefer HaYashar, his brother, his older brother, who by the way, his name sounds very familiar to one of the other pharaohs. And I want to mention something about the names of the pharaohs too. This is, by the way, this is the pyramid of Pepi II, who ruled for 94 years. I've often heard it say that the Israelites built the Great Pyramid. Why is that not true? The Great Pyramid is made of what? Stones. The Israelites built with what? Bricks, made with straw. This pyramid from Pepi II is in such bad shape because most of it was fashioned with bricks. The only part that is existing today at Saqqara are the stones they used also as some of the layer, but it was also made with mud bricks. This is why it's in such bad shape. Give you a little close-up there. All right. Now, I've already told you about Nefertiti. This is what Egyptologist Barbara Mertz has told us about her. That the fact that she was the last ruler of the 6th dynasty. Any man, including Manetho, will tell you that was a bad time. Manetho, of course, was an Egyptian historian who wrote history for the Greeks. This is Professor Hawass, who gave me a personal tour of a new tomb. This is how we can take the dynastic chart and roughly line it up with the story of the exile and finally the Exodus with the Seder HaOlam. All right? Let me go back very quickly. And of course we have here, this is the Egyptian record. At the end of the reign of Neferkari II and his son, we have a sudden and unexplained decline of Egypt, the end of the Old Kingdom. Over here we have the Exodus and of course the destruction of Egypt. This is the Ipuwer papyrus. I will not take the time to read this to you, but I have a copy of the entire translation in my library. If you want to see, I have also brought with me a Xerox copy of the book. It's very precious to me because I'm still going through it. The reason I mention it, many of you have heard of this, the translator of the Ipuwer papyrus, which was found at Saqqara in the sands there. There's a lot of argument as to what period this came from. It's written in hieratic, which was the cursive form of hieroglyphs. And this document goes on for pages, and it is an Egyptian version. It is an Egyptian priest, Ipuwer, recounting the woes of Egypt in the time of their great fall. And the gentleman who translated it, his first opinion was that it was written at the end of the Old Kingdom period. Others have said, no, it wasn't. It was Middle Kingdom period. But the Middle Kingdom period was the period of chaos after the end of the Old Kingdom. So I don't have it in front of me to read, and I don't have my glasses, so I couldn't read it anyway. But let me very quickly, I want to recount to you that it speaks of, for instance, plagues. It speaks of plagues. It says, forsooth, the river is blood. It says, and remember Moshe Rabbeinu was told to take the blood and to pour it onto the ground and to start the plague of blood. The Ipuwer papyrus says, he who poured water on the ground has captured the strong man in misery. You can read the verses from Ipuwer in my book, and they are aligned parallel to the passages from the Exodus that sound just like you're reading the Jewish version, the Torah version, and the Egyptian version. There is the story of the river being turned to blood. There is hail. There is fire. It speaks of all the herbs and green things of Egypt being destroyed. It tells of the dead everywhere. It tells of a brother being taken while his brother is left alive. How does this happen? Possibly the brother was firstborn. It says the king was taken away by foreigners of the land. And something I found just recently, the other one is, what did Moshe Rabbeinu tell the Israelites to do just before they left? They were told to borrow the gold and silver from their neighbors, because sort of back payment for their wages. It says in the Ipuwer papyrus, it says, slave girls are wearing gold and silver and precious yebet stone and fine garments. It also tells us something that I find it particularly intriguing. Me'am Loez tells us, and other sources tell us, that when the Exodus began, all the nations began to hear about what had happened to Egypt. And the first nation that attacked Egypt was Amalek. And when Amalek came into Egypt, the first thing they did was they opened up the census records of the Egyptians. And the sages tell us that they took the census records and they went back up and they attacked the Israelites from the rear, and they used psychological warfare on them. They used the census records of the Israelites, and they called out to the names of the families and their individual names, kind of like an Amalek Tokyo Rose, if you will, to weaken the resolve of the Israelites. Well, they know our name. And this is an amazing thing to read in the Midrash that Amalek tried to do. They were the first terrorists, if you will. In the Ippur Papyrus, there is a line that has baffled the translators for a long time. They wonder why the invaders would do this. It says, a tribe from a foreign land has come into our country, and they've opened up our halls and taken our census list. I don't know about you, but I'm convinced this man was writing about the aftermath of the Exodus. If we can believe that the Old Kingdom period, the 6th dynasty, was the period that was brought to an end by the Exodus, we can also look in a previous dynasty for evidence of the great sage Yossi. Joseph, who was prime minister of Egypt. Can we find any figure that resembles Joseph? Joseph, who according to the Chazal was not only a great prime minister, he was an artisan, he knew medicine, he knew mathematics. If we look into that time period, and by the way, Genesis, Bereshit, tells us that when he sent a message to his father, he said to Joseph, he said, come, he says, God has made me a father to Pharaoh. In the Old Kingdom idiom, in the Old Kingdom period, the prime minister was called Itif. Do you know what the direct translation of Itif is? It means father to Pharaoh. Hence that phrase. This is Imhotep. I believe that Imhotep is Joseph. Joseph served as prime minister for 80 years. He died at the age of 110. Imhotep is famous because he died at the age of 110. And Imhotep was so wise that they said all the way down to the time of the time of Cleopatra, there was a saying in Egypt that to attain perfect wisdom and sagacity, you had to reach the age of 110. And that saying came from the Old Kingdom period. Imhotep lived to be 110. He was a great mathematician. He knew medicine. He knew astronomy. All the things that Joseph is credited with knowing and bringing to the Egyptians. There's something else interesting about Imhotep. He built the Step Pyramid. He designed it. He built it for King Zoser. This is down on one of the lower cataracts of the Nile. This is an inscription of the pharaoh called Isesi. He's speaking with Imhotep, and he's telling Imhotep to help the country of Egypt because of a 7-year famine. He's asking Imhotep. This is the pyramid of Unas. Unas was a pharaoh who had a prime minister. He listened to him all the time. Joseph possibly was prime minister for this man in the last few years of Joseph's sitting on the throne, not the throne, but sitting in the chair of prime minister. Along his causeway, this is his pyramid, along this causeway is a carving that shows starving foreigners coming to Egypt to be saved from starvation. Did not all the countries of the Near East come to Egypt in the time of the famine to be fed? Didn't Joseph provide a way to feed all the countries that came to their land? By the way, there's a source that tells us that one of the ways that Joseph was able to feed all of the Near East is he bought grain for 7 years also. He bought grain, and when the grain came from another country, he had them bring the earth from their own country, and they put this in the silos, and this kept the grain from spoiling. So we have another thing here that in the tomb I've been in this tomb. Zahi Hawass got me into this. It's closed to the public. I shot video. The reason I bring this up is because if Unas is also a pharaoh who knew Joseph, one who had not forgotten what he had done for the country, they would have had conversations. And Unas, I would think, would have heard of Joseph's God. Now, Would Joseph had said the name of his God in front of Pharaoh? No. This would be very curious to the Pharaoh. This inscription in the tomb of Unas, it's called the pyramid text, extols the virtues of this dead Pharaoh, Pharaoh Unas. It tells us what he does in the afterlife. And it names all of the gods that he frolics with in the Egyptian Elysian fields, if you will, and everything that he does with each of these gods. There's one God he mentions, though, that troubles the translators. And this is what the inscription says: Unas will judge with him whose name is hidden in the day of the slaying of the eldest. Does that sound like the Hebrew God? They went to pains to mention every god on these inscriptions in the Egyptian pantheon. But there was one God whose name was hidden, and I challenge you to go to your text on Egyptian gods and to find any god who has no name. Friends, Egypt was voodoo central. It was a veritable shopping mall of gods. But there's one God on this inscription that they couldn't mention his name. And by the way, Unas thought he's going to sit with him in the day of the slaying of the eldest, the killing of the firstborn. Isn't your firstborn usually your eldest? Now, by the way, that's just my own conclusion. But I think it's interesting that this Pharaoh, who would have been a Pharaoh during Joseph's time, puts that on his tomb. There's another very curious geographical designation. This is the Nile. This is the El Fayum. It's a great natural depression on the west side of the Nile. It's a great oasis. It's a man-made oasis. It was made in antiquity. And according to an ancient legend, this is not in the Midrash, it's an ancient, actually Arabic legend. And it says that when Joseph was 100 years old, 10 years away from his death, Pharaoh came to him and said, look, the new advisors think that possibly you are sitting on your laurels and you're an old man, and you need to prove to them that you still have what it takes to be prime minister, to be wazir. And Joseph says, well, I've got one project I'd like to undertake. I'd like to create an oasis for the western part of Egypt, on the other side of the Nile. So he constructs a canal. And we know this, all Egyptologists agree that this is an ancient man-made oasis. Carol and I have been there. We had to go under armed guard because they said of terrorists and snakes. Same thing. And what waters this oasis is an ancient water channel called Ba'ar Yosef, the Sea of Joseph. And that's what it looks like right there. All right, now, if you go to Bereshit chapter 28, verse 12, you'll read this about Jacob's ladder. We know that in any portion of the Torah, when you read an inscription, it's multi-level in meanings. Well, about the time that I read this in Toledot, I was also reading a book about DNA. And it struck me that what they described in very, very basic level terms of what DNA was bore an exact resemblance to what I had just read here, because we have angels going up and down the ladder. All of Chazal tell us that was 4 angels. One of the explanations is that it represents the four major civilizations that would impact Israel. So we know there's 4 angels. And they're going up and down this ladder. The word for this ladder, this is the only time this word appears in the entire Torah. So that told me it was significant. The word is sulam. Sulam, if you take out the vowels, has the same consonants as the word slalom, which is the way you go down a hill. You slalom down a hill. I happen to subscribe to the theories of all words come from Hebrew. And slalom is a word we borrowed from the Swedish, but it could have gone back to slalom, to the spiral staircase, this ladder, this DNA strand that Jacob dreamed of with 4 angels. What is an angel? What does Malachim really mean? Messenger. Do you know what the text that I was reading said that the DNA acids, the 4 acids, their job was? They were messengers. So we know that the DNA holds the key to also proving the Exodus story. And it will be the key that will provide the return of the Kohanim, obviously. I know you all know this story. There are several books about finding the Cohen haplotype, the DNA marker. And they said this is sort of like it's a marker that attached itself. It's sort of a mutation. It had to attach itself to the DNA strand later. But they did the math, and they said, well, the DNA for the Cohen haplotype that is specific to people who come from the priesthood, it attached itself. It appeared approximately just over 3,000 years ago. When did the Exodus occur? 3,300 some odd years ago. Also, we have one last thing I'd like, and of course this is more about the Cohen haplotype. People have said to me, there's no way there could have been millions of people coming out of the land of Egypt appearing at Mount Sinai. There is a mathematician, he's Jewish, he is an observant Jew, and if you read his credentials, he is a staggering mathematician. He lives in New Jersey. He's worked for space labs. Andy might even know him, I don't know. His name is Dr. Solomon Dinkovich. He took the math that they use for population growth, the actual formula, he took it and applied it to the Torah with 70 people, and he came up with this. He said, utilizing the figures given in the Torah, we can show that the growth of the Israelites from 70 people to 10 million to 12 million over 210 years may be reached with an average of 3 to 9 sons per family. Now, why is the story of the Exodus, the event of the Exodus, important to the Jewish people? Why is it important to Noahides? Because if the Exodus didn't happen, then Sinai didn't happen, and we are following falsehood. And I don't believe that's true. And this is, and of course, I believe in the Exodus and in the Torah for many reasons, but look at this. It also is the key to the ownership of the land of Israel. That event connects them to Eretz Israel. This is why. Abraham was told on that day, God made a covenant with Abraham saying to your descendants, I have given this land for the Egyptian river that far as the great river Euphrates. God said, I am the God who took you out of Ur Kasdim to give you this land as a possession. And Abraham says, Hashem, how can I know that this land that you've promised me is going to be mine? He tells him to go out and take these kosher animals and do the covenant between the pieces. This is what follows this question, is the covenant between the pieces. But then the verbal answer, the verbal reply that is given to Abraham to this question, how will I know this land belongs to me? And this is the answer. Oops. Okay. Well, anyway. The answer is the Torah scripture that we read earlier, because your descendants will go into enslavement, oppression, etc. for 400 years, and you will leave, and the people who enslave you, I will judge them, and you will come out with great riches. The Exodus experience is the reason that Abraham would know. That was Hashem's reply to him. When he said, how will I know the land belongs to me? Basically, Hashem said, because you experienced the entire Exodus saga. Thank you.